If you're starting to look at seed catalogs or looking at plants to buy for your garden, it's also time to start looking at your home canning equipment if you're planning to do any canning. The couple of things that you need to think about is what kind of canner you have and what kind of canning you're planning to do. If you're doing tomatoes, pickles, jams, jellies, you need a water bath canner. This is it. You need to make sure you still got the rack in the bottom, that it's in good condition as far as not dented or chipped or that kind of thing, but there's not a lot that you have to do beyond that. These should be stored with the lid upside down in a dry place so you don't get any rust, and they'll last for years. So that's a really good investment, a good way to start canning if you haven't done it before and you're looking at fruits, pickles, jams, jellies, preserves, those kinds of things. This is the way to go. Really fairly inexpensive too. If, however, you want to can vegetables or meat, then you need to look at your pressure canner. If you've already got one, then you need to study it and make sure that it's in good condition about this time of year, because if there's some things that need to be replaced, it can be a kind of a time-consuming practice of getting something ordered or finding the replacement parts, and you don't want to miss that first round of green beans because you're still waiting for your new gauge to come in. So look at how you stored it the year before. We've got a couple of different kinds of canners that we keep around for use. They basically are going to accomplish the same purpose, and it really doesn't matter which one you have. It's personal preference or which one you've got available. At this point in time, you're going to notice how I've stored this. I've taken the lid, turned it upside down, and put it in a brown paper bag. What we want to do is make sure that the lid is protected. This particular one is a dial gauge, and it's really critical that the dial be kept in good condition, because bumping it, jarring it, all those things can damage it and it'll have to be replaced. And so you want to make sure that it's in good shape. So store it that way. The other thing that I've done in preparing it for storage is to fill the canner with old newspaper. Simply wad it up and stick it in there. Make sure that at the bottom of the canner you have the counterweight. In this case, since this is a dial gauge, this is simply a counterweight, and you want to make sure that you know where that's at, because you can't work the canner without it. So simply keep it in the bottom. Also at the very bottom we have a rack. And it's always important to make sure that you've got a rack. You can jury rig one if you don't have one, but it's there to keep the jars off the bottom so that the water can circulate underneath the jars. Make sure that you have that convection current moving. If the jars are sitting directly on the bottom of the canner, you don't have those convection currents in the water underneath the jar. You also are going to have more apt to have jars break because they're sitting directly on the source of the heat. The next thing you want to look at on this canner or a weighted gauge canner is to make sure that all the vents are working, to make sure that if there's any problem, that any of these kinds of places can be replaced. This is the overpressure plug, and you'll find that it can be popped out, taken out from the bottom. And if it's in good condition, it should be sort of rubbery and flexible. The other thing you're going to want to look at on any kind of canner is this. This would enable you to seal the canner down. This is actually called the sealing ring, and if it gets old, it gets dry, it gets brittle, you'll start to have steam leak around the edges. If you have a little bit of steam or a little bit of leakage as the canner is warming up, that's one thing, but if it's a constant stream as the canner is pressurized, that's something else. These usually need to be replaced every couple of years, and how you take care of it is dependent on what the manufacturer tells you. So you should never use a canner or buy a canner if you're going to a used garage sale or something like that. Never buy one unless you can get the manual that goes with it. Now, if it's a National or a Presto or one of the major brands, you can probably find those at their website. But make sure that you do have that, because without it, you're kind of shooting in the dark. You don't know how to treat it, whether it needs oil, whether it needs to be boiled before you use it, whether it needs to be washed, how it needs to be treated. And all of those things affect the processing time and the safety of the food that you're going to eat and feed to your family later. So make sure that it's in good condition. The dial on your canner needs to be checked. If you're using a dial gauge canner, and again, this is personal preference or what you have available, you need to take it to your county educator or your extension office and make sure that you get that checked at least once a year. If your county can't do that for you, then you need to take it off. It is something that you can remove, and mail it to the company and have them check it. Don't use it without it, because if it's off by more than a pound, you may be running the risk of underprocessing the food, providing botulism toxin to those who are feeding that food to, and nobody wants to do that. Another thing you want to check on your canner is to make sure that all the handles are in good condition. Make sure that they're tight. And we have another canner here. This is a weighted gauge version. We store it basically the same. Again, with the paper bag to keep it in good condition. But you'll notice that there is no dial on this one. This is a weighted gauge. And then down amongst all these old newspapers in here, which are simply here, by the way, to make sure that we keep it dry inside. We also don't want to close it down or tighten it down, because if you do that, you have to get a lot of moisture trapped inside. You get mold and mildew developed. You get a lot of off odors and bad odors trapped in the canner, and we don't want any of those things to happen. So again, you're going to check the overpressure plug. You're going to make sure that all the vent ports and the escape hatches are in good condition. You're going to check the sealing ring, make sure it's in good condition. But you'll notice that there is no dial that has to be checked. You don't have to take this kind to the county office. It's simply a weight. There are different types. They come into 3 pieces, so you can work with 5 pounds, 10 pounds, or 15 pounds pressure. For a lot of Oklahoma, altitude-wise, you're going to, oops, upside down, you're going to have to work with the 15 pounds pressure if you're working with a weighted gauge. So there is a little bit of disadvantage to that. You'll notice I mentioned you want to check the handles. This one is wobbly, and you want to make sure that that is not going to be a risk later on. So it's easy to fix in most cases. Take a Phillips head screwdriver. Notice there's a Phillips head screw in here. Simply tighten that up just a little bit, and you'll be good to go. Rack in the bottom, manual available. One last thing you need to make sure that's set before you try to do any canning with it. You're going to want to look through the vent port. And no matter what kind of canner you have, this is an easy thing to do. You notice that it sticks up here. In this case, the weighted gauge will sit on it. There's a separate one on a dial gauge canner, and you want to simply look through that, make sure you can see all the way through, because we need steam to be able to come out of that at a steady pace for a minimum of 10 minutes when you start using that canner. If you can't see through it, if it's clogged, then you want to get a pipe cleaner and try to run that pipe cleaner through it and clear it out. Don't use a toothpick or some other wooden piece to try and do that job, because it's apt to break off, and then you have not only what the original clog was, but now the toothpick is in there too. Again, if you need to have spare parts, replacement parts, the best place to go is other stores where they normally sell canning gear. A lot of times these days, however, it's hard to find replacement parts. So make sure that you, if you can't find them locally, go online, check the company, and generally that you'll be able to order them via the mail. Remember to do this early though, because you don't want to have to find out at the last minute that your dial gauge needs to be replaced when it's time to can the potatoes. For Oklahoma Gardening, this is Barbara Brown. Learning to pressure can is one of the most valuable things you can do if you're interested in doing any kind of low acid food. It is essential. So today we're going to kind of give you a quick run through on how pressure canning works. I'm looking at carrots today, mostly because they're easy to do. They're available, and it's a good way to practice on how to go about it. One of the things that's important is to get all your pieces about the same size. So get your carrot peeled. It's important that you peel them ahead of time. We don't want the peels falling off, and some things are thick and can't penetrate. And then cut them all about the same size. With carrots, they're usually going to go into coins. And then the next stage after you get that done is to start loading your jars. Make sure you've got home canning jars. Check them to make sure there aren't any nicks or cracks. Run your finger around the top to make sure that there's no nick there as well. And then start working with the carrots. Now I'm doing what's called a raw pack or a cold pack. You can also hot pack, and that's a little bit different technique. But we have carrots. Now they're a little bit different sizes because carrots taper, and I'm not interested in making sure that they're all exactly the same size. When you get down to the very ends, you may want to try and make the volume a little bit closer. Raw pack is easy because there's nothing hot to work with, and it looks like it's going to give you the best, easiest option. In the end, hot pack actually gives you better quality and better fill in the jar. But we've got the carrots in the jar. Notice I've overfilled it. We're actually going to look to fill it about to this point. But we're going to try to settle the carrots down by tapping on the bottom of the jar against the palm of your hand, not against a glass. And you notice that we get quite a bit of settling as we go through that process. And then you look at it and you say, well, it's obviously too many, so I'm going to take a couple of carrots out, try and settle them in a little bit better. And then we're ready for one of two things. Now, if you chose, you could add salt to this at this point in time. You'd add a kind of salt that is for home canning, or kosher salt. If you don't want to add salt with carrots or other low-acid vegetables, that's fine. It's simply in there for the taste. There's no safety factor. It doesn't do anything for color. It's simply flavor. So now we're ready to add the liquid, and we want to get the food under the liquid and the liquid up to the 1-inch mark with carrots. Now, as you can see, or maybe you can't see really well, I'll get this empty jar. Right here on the jar, there's a line that goes around. That's the 1-inch mark, so you don't have to get a ruler out. You can if you choose to, just till you get the hang of it. But that's where we're going, and we want to have the liquid under there, and we want to have the vegetable under there. Next step on this, you can see there are a few bubbles in there. They're still moving around. We want to get all those bubbles and all that trapped air we can out. So I'm using a bubble popper to do this. If you don't have an official one, you can see some of the bubbles going out. We want as much air out as we can because it's going to cause us nothing but problems later. If you don't have an official bubble popper, you can use a plastic knife from the supermarket or a fast food place, that kind of thing as well. So we're going to press those down. We still have some. We've dropped the liquid because we left some of the bubbles out. Some of the air disappeared. Now we can play with this a little bit and get it to the point where we want it. So we're going to still keep pushing our carrots. If some of the carrots are too big, if they're too full, you want to try and get them under there. But these carrots are raw, and so as they're cooking, they're going to collapse a little bit. So if I have a little piece of a carrot when I got a raw pack sticking out of the liquid, I'm pretty comfortable with that. At that point, that looks pretty good. As I said, those are going to settle somewhat during the canning process. I'm going to get these out of the way and move on to the next stage. Now, the next stage is we want to make sure that there are no food particles, no salt particles, or anything else on this part of the jar. So we're going to take a clean paper towel and get it a little bit damp and run that just around the edge. That's all it takes. And that gives any salt that you might have gotten on the edge or any carrot chips or anything else out of there. Our next stage is to get a flat. Now when you use flats, these are one-use items. You can only use them once ever, because this sealing compound is going to conform to the shape of the lip of the jar. And so we can't use them twice because it won't conform to two different jars. You won't get a seal. So we're going to put that on our jar, get the sealing ring or the ring on there, and make sure that it's snug. You don't want it too tight. If you get it too tight, our goal here in canning is to form a vacuum in the space between the top of the food in the liquid and the bottom of the flat. And right now there's a lot of air trapped in here, and in the canner we want to get rid of that air. We want to evacuate that. And then when the jar comes out of the canner, since there's no air in there, the flat is going to be pulled down onto the jar, and that's when you actually get the seal. So we want this to be snug but not too tight, because if it's too tight the air can't get out, and you may end up with jars that don't seal, bulging a little bit on the lid as the air tries to get out, or you may get something that looks like the inside of cardboard that may seal but is not a real safe seal, and so you'd want to use those jars fairly quickly. Now we are raw packing. We want to get all our jars ready at the same time. Don't do one jar ahead and then wait for the next morning to get the rest if you've got one left over, because you can get some spoilage microorganisms starting in that jar, and we don't want that to happen either. The canner, at this point, you should have started to warm the water in your canner. We're raw packing, so we want the water in our canner, in our pressure canner, to be about 2 inches deep. And this is whether you're raw packing or hot packing. And I'm going to use a spoon so I can get a feel for how deep that water is. You can see that's about 1 to 2 inches is what you're going to need, and the depth of that water is going to depend on how long foods are going to be in the canner. If they're going to be in there for 90 minutes, you're going to want to definitely go with the 2 inches. For a shorter time, then you're going to you can go with 1 inch. The thing is, you don't want the canner to go dry. So if you start with 2 inches all the time, you're fine. Jars should go in. Try to keep them straight up and down as much as you can at this point, because you don't want any liquid coming in under the seal and getting in the way. We're going to put our lid on. Remember, you've checked your canner. If you're using a dial gauge canner, you've had that tested. If you're using a weighted gauge canner like I am, that doesn't need to be tested, but you want to make sure that the vent port is clear. Turn the heat up on the canner, and we're going to bring this up to a point where we see constant steam coming through the vent port, and at that point we're going to start exhausting the canner. So we're going to wait for that to happen, and then we'll check and see what the next step is. What you see happening with the canner now is a constant flow of steam coming out the vent port, and this is called exhausting or venting the canner, and it's extremely important. It needs to be a strong, steady steam, and it needs to go for 10 minutes. So I'm going to click on going. What's happening inside the canner is that the air that's in the canner around the jars is being forced out, and that's going to give us a higher temperature than if you don't do this. If you leave this step off, you're going to have a lower temperature in your canner than you would otherwise. You potentially underprocess your food, and since these are high-risk items as far as making sure that we get rid of all the microorganisms that can cause botulism toxin, we want to make sure that we process this food at the appropriate temperature. So we're going to let this happen. Notice that we already have some pressure built up in the canner. We have some of the escape hatches, so to speak, the overpressure plug and the locking mechanism here are already pressurized, but we're not actually pressurizing the canner. If you had a dial gauge canner, you'd see the pressure in the dial move up maybe to 1 or 2 pounds pressure. This again is going to go for 10 minutes. Okay, we've got our 10 minutes up. Notice the steam has continued. You've left your burner on high. You're now ready to close the canner down so the pressure can start to build. And here you've got some decisions to make, because with a weighted gauge canner, you need to know how many pieces of the weight to put on. These come apart, or they have a different piece that you put on to make the weight gain. This is 10 pounds of pressure on this one. If I put it together, I've got 15 pounds. You need to know your altitude here as well, because if you're at the altitude we are in Stillwater, which is below 1,000 feet, we only need to can with 10 pounds pressure on our carrots. If you live where it's over 1,000 feet, you need the 15 pounds pressure. With a dial gauge canner, you're going to be looking at something different. You've got to find the directions for the canner that you use. You need to know your altitude, what you're working with inside there, so that you can make the appropriate decisions to get safe food when it comes out. Take a little bit of precaution when you're sliding this on. Make sure that you have a glove on or a mitt, because we want to slide this across, and we don't want to have any chance that we're going to come in contact with that steam, which is really, really hot. This we need to bring up to the point where the manufacturer is going to tell you how many times this needs to rock or jiggle. So you're going to follow those instructions for your specific canner. And when it starts to rock or jiggle, while you've got the heat on high under the burner, then you can start turning the heat down and adjusting it. For this location where I'm at under 1,000 feet, canning carrots that are raw packed, I'm going to have to bring this up to pressure at the appropriate amount of jiggle, and it's going to go for 25 minutes. And then we'll be ready to turn the heat off. Once you can see that you've got that jiggle going, this is when you start your timer for your 25 minutes. You don't start it until the pressure is up to pace. Also, at this point, you don't want the canner to go dry. With a weighted gauge canner, if it's jiggling really fast, you still have the appropriate pressure. The concern is whether or not you're losing too much water. So I'm going to, and using too much energy as well. So I'm going to turn the burner down. Keep in mind that if the pressure drops, if it stops jiggling, or if the pressure drops below 11, you've got to start over. You bring it back up to pressure, start your timer again, and begin the whole thing again. So try to keep the pressure maintained. We also don't want it going up and down and fluctuating, because if it does, you're going to lose liquid inside the jar, and that's going to cause you problems later on. So keep it steady and make sure it's maintained at the appropriate amount. Once your timer goes off and you've used the appropriate amount of time for what you're canning, and you've kept the pressure steady during that time, all you have to do at this point is turn off your burner. Now, if you have a gas range like this one, when you turn off the burner, the heat's going to stop immediately, and you can probably walk away. If you have an electric range, however, you're going to want to slide it to the side, because you really want to stop the cooking. You cannot open the canner at this point. You couldn't even if you wanted to on most of them, because there's a locking mechanism under here, this locking port. What we're going to do is wait probably about the same amount of time as it took to can it for the pressure to drop to zero. These vents will drop at that point. The pressure, if you've got a dial gauge, will drop to zero. And at that point, you're going to take the weight off, and then you're going to wait 10 additional minutes to make sure that it's completely depressurized inside the canner before you open it. Okay, as you can see, the canner has now cooled. We've waited an extra 10 minutes, and now you can lift off the weights and start to open the canner. Always remember that there's going to be a lot of very hot steam come out of this thing, and so you're going to want to open it so that the steam goes away from you or in my case as well, the cameraman. And you can see the carrots in there. Now, what you're going to see in the carrots that we pull out, these carrots are actually still boiling in the jar. Make sure that you get your lifter set so that there's no, you've got it underneath the rings here. You don't want it to actually slip. And you can actually still see the boiling in the jar. This is the only time that you should actually see bubbles moving in your jar, is when it's still really, really hot like this. You'll also see here that we have a lot of liquid at the bottom of the jar, and there's no carrots down there. And the carrots are a little bit high in the jar, and that we can expect particularly when we cold pack or raw pack, because we didn't get all the air out of the carrots themselves by cooking them a short time ahead of time. And so you're going to have more opportunity for floating and a looser fit in the jar. Set them out of a breeze, not under a fan or an air conditioner vent or in front of an open window, on a few layers of paper toweling. And at this point, you're just going to walk away. If there's a little puddle of water on the top, don't worry about it. You're going to come back within between 12 hours and 24 hours after the canning process, and at that point you're going to check the seal. But at this point, it's time for bed or whatever else you're going to be doing during the day. These carrots are, as much as we can tell, done. What we have over here, as you'll look, is an example of a hot pack versus that raw pack. Notice that the jar is much better filled by doing that little bit extra cooking, and that can in essence mean that you have to can one less jar later on. It uses the space more efficiently and actually gives you a better quality. These aren't perfect. We do have a little bit of carrot, if I can get it open, a little bit of carrot over the top of the jar. But for all intents and purposes, these are good enough to go on the shelf. These would not be good enough to go to the fair and judge well, because of that carrot sticking out is going to start to cause some browning and some lower quality. This one is sealed and ready to go. Remember, don't even touch that one or breathe on it hard for at least 12 hours, or you may break any seal that you're going to form during the cooling process. I hope this has given you an overview of how canning works, how pressure canning works. Once you get practice with something like a carrot, you can move on to green beans or beets or whatever else it is you want to put in a jar and put through a pressure canner. It's understanding those principles and make sure you're doing it very carefully, following the directions exactly, knowing your altitude. Those are the things that are going to be essential to doing it well, doing it safely, so that you have food throughout the winter at no additional cost through running your freezer. I hope you'll give it a try. For Oklahoma Gardening, this is Barbara Brown.